John?
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. Um, we really hope that we'll manage to have hopefully a productive conversation, but we'll first sort of introduce what is happening at the moment generally in Israel and Palestine, and in terms of interreligious relations and interreligious dialogue in the land. And then we'll speak about what is the Rossing Center doing at the moment, and perhaps also suggest some tips that may or may not be relevant for your own context. So each of us will speak for about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So please, if you do have questions, feel free to ask them. And me and Ophir, I think, very much welcome any question. So do not be cautious if you want to ask also a controversial question. I think me and Ophir welcome them very much. So we really look forward to speaking to you and engaging with you. And of course, we have a long relationship with FODIP, so we're always happy to see faces of friends. So Ophir will start, and then I will follow after Ophir.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, John. I won't waste our time repeating what John said, but I endorse all of it. If I may, I commend FODIP for everything it does and for convening this session to talk about dialogue and interreligious work in these difficult times. So I'm going to try and share my screen and see if we get this to, where are we? No, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing wrong?
Let me know if you want me to share it, Ophir.
Do we need to make somebody co-host?
No, I seem to have that.
He is.
I seem to have that, but I don't. It never seems to do what I want it to. I remember. You go for this. John, you would know, or am I showing my whole screen?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. I too, Sadia, I'm rusty. But it's great that we can do this. So we at the Rossing Center, founded by Daniel Rossing, whom some of you were lucky enough to meet, have been doing this work for well over a decade, and never under such challenging circumstances. But I would like to, no, how do I move? Can't change my slide. What am I doing wrong? Okay. But never under such troubling circumstances. So we're going to try and address the three questions which you posed to us. What is it like in the region for Israelis and Palestinians currently? How has the current situation impacted interreligious work and dialogue? And how specifically are we at the Rossing Center dealing with these issues? I think it would be worthwhile, even though I know that many of you are more than conversant in the issues and familiar with the region, to nonetheless take a small step back and just remind ourselves of some of the characteristics. Even before October 7th and before the war in Gaza, we, Israelis and Palestinians, live in a very separate reality. We are side by side, even those of us who are citizens of Israel, like John and myself. So much the more so, Israeli citizens and Palestinians who are our neighbors, but not citizens of Israel, whether they be in the West Bank or in Gaza. We are side by side, but we do not meet, as I am told is the case in the Alaska Bay, but I've never been there. Your typical Israeli Jew, and I will try to always say Israeli Jew when I mean Israeli Jews, and not simply Israeli or simply Jew, because of course we have Palestinians who are Israelis and Palestinians who are not Israelis. Your typical Israeli Jew and your typical Arab Palestinian Israeli will not have much to do with one another during most of their early years in life. They most likely live in different neighborhoods, not because of segregation, but because the Jews tend to be urban, and historically speaking, the Arab population has been, for the most part, rural. They will go to separate schools because they go to school where they live. Even if they were to live together, there would be linguistic challenges in going to school together because we speak different languages. Jews, of course, speaking Hebrew, and Palestinian Arabs speaking Arabic. More Arabs know Hebrew than Jews know Arabic. But even amongst first graders, not very many Arabs speak Hebrew. As we go through school, participate in youth movements, attend after school activities, and do whatever it is we do until we complete high school, we do it separate from the other. The first time that a Palestinian youth and a young Israeli Jew are likely to meet one another in the same place at the same time, doing the same thing, is probably the university, for those who go to university, and many do. But even there, it's not a very level playing field, because the Israeli Jews have, for the most part, already attended the army, served in the army for 2 or 3 or 4 years, while the Palestinians can begin university if they choose at 18 or 19. And so those are populations even there that are very, very, very different. And so we are side by side, but we don't meet. And that means that the background situation before the trying times in which we are now is already one which presents tremendous challenges to bring people together, to become acquainted with others as individuals and as collectives, to learn about the other society, the other religion, its beliefs, its customs, its traditions, its folkways, not to mention its language. All of these are very substantial hurdles, and they form a large part of the background to where we find ourselves today in the far more trying situation. So just remembering these characteristics, which have always been part of our reality and continue to be part of our reality, we move on to what's going on right now. Now, I see my screen is not behaving the way I wanted, but on a separate screen, I'll see some notes. Okay. And so the first thing I just want to say is that intergroup, interreligious, Jewish, Arab, we can use many different types of language to describe these various groups. Groups are continuing to meet. There are many initiatives that are bringing people together. These are trying times, but you may be surprised to know that many, and this is just one example of an interesting group in Jaffa, south of Tel Aviv, which is continuing to meet. As we speak, this Interfaith March for Human Rights and Peace is concluding, literally as we speak. They're now convening for a dialogue session at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And you can see at the bottom of the screen, oh, gee, I counted them when I cut and paste this, but there are about 22 or 23 different organizations which support this initiative. That is to say, not every Jew or Palestinian is engaged in dialogue and working with the other, but neither are we alone. The Rossing Center is on that list as sponsors, as are many other wonderful organizations. So there is work going on, but how is our work changed? I won't start from scratch, although John may have the opportunity to go back a little bit. But what are some of the emphases that characterize our work today? Our organization was founded as JCJCR, the Jerusalem Center for Jewish Christian Relations. And the reason it was founded by Daniel Rossing was because he sensed that in the reality of the three faiths of Jerusalem and Israel and Palestine, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, there was a unique aspect to the Jewish-Christian dialogue, and that the small Christian minority was in danger of getting lost. Pulse as needs evolve, change, endure crisis, and respond to those crises has been our methodology. And so the crisis today is a breakdown of, in some cases, of relationships, a severe testing of trust, and in some cases, even limitations on mobility and access to one another, or perceived limitations on where one is comfortable going, and so on and so forth. And so this may be surprising, I don't know. One of the most important tools which we are using in order to bring together is to keep them separate. That is to say, when we do convene a Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian Arab group, and we bring them together in proximity, a significant amount of that time, of our time, more than ever in the past, is spent in what we call uninational or unireligious meetings. That is to say, it is so important for the Jews to talk amongst other Jews in the safe space of talking entre nous about what it means to be in dialogue with the other. And when these internal conversations take place and bear fruit, the participants are more ready to engage with the other side, Palestinians with Israelis, Israelis with Palestinians. And so maybe that's surprising, but we spend more time not talking to each other in order to be able to talk to each other. Another generalization would be that we are emphasizing our attempt to do our work in the most robust way possible, in as holistic an approach as possible. That is to say, not to have a little intervention with one class in a school or one grade in a school, but to try to work with the entire school. In fact, municipal Department of Education, to try and have systemic influence and not isolated individual islands of change, which may not be sustainable. The goals of creating, nurturing shared society is quite an uphill struggle, and we need to have all the forces, or try to have all the forces working together. I think another important aspect that I would emphasize is when we get together to talk, one of the most important things that we do is encourage people to listen. We talk about getting together to talk. What we really mean is to get together and listen to one another. So often in all of the dialogues, and I'm sure you're familiar with this to one extent or another, when my interlocutor is speaking, I am as much planning my rebuttal or my reaction as I am listening to what he or she has to say. And so practicing and developing dedicated listening skills are a tool which is even more important, far more important than it's ever been in the past. Mindful, active listening. And giving people, those who participate in sessions, the sense that they are indeed listened to. The last example I'll give, or the last pair of examples I'll give, is to note that we are in trauma. We are all together in trauma, and maybe now is the time to go back to that very first question: how is it affecting Israelis and Palestinians today? And I'll speak for myself. Although I'll say that neither I nor John are combatants bearing weapons in what's going on. But neither are we insulated from the repercussions of all of that. We each, in our own ways, are very much touched by it. And I will just give you a couple of examples just to be personal and let you know where I'm coming from. Most of my children, I have 5, most of my children have had a teacher or a school principal killed in the war. My son is serving in the army, in the Israel Defense Forces. I'm very pleased that he was only in Gaza for 12 days. But on the 12th day, his commander and 3 of his buddies were killed. We have adopted a dog in our family because our neighbor was killed and we took the dog. So on so many levels, I didn't mention my daughter. She complains that her brother in the army doesn't come home often enough. She would like to see him more. To which her classmate and good friend says, at least you still have a brother who you hope can come home and expect to come home. So we're all touched in very, very personal and very, very powerful ways. And I tell you that not to sob before you, although it's difficult, but to emphasize how much we are societies in trauma. Some people will undoubtedly be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, but to one degree or another, we are all in trauma. And one of the tools of the Rossing Center, which is, I think, it's becoming more and more and more important in our work, is a project called Healing Hatred. And I'll just say something about the rationale of that project. Maybe John will get into more detail or not, depending on time. But at the moment, from the Israeli perspective, from the Israeli Jewish perspective, the war is on our border. But there have been times in the past when there are incidents of terror, buses that are blown up and restaurants that are sites of terror. War is on our streets. And the normal reaction when one of these atrocities take place is to rush people off to the hospital, fix the broken glass of the windows that were smashed, call in the fire brigade to wash down the streets and get rid of all the blood. And then everything looks the way it did the day before. Everyone goes home and hates the other side even more than they did yesterday. And that, unfortunately, is considered normal. So our project, Healing Hatred, is based on the, I hope it sounds obvious, but it doesn't come naturally, the idea that hatred is not natural. It's certainly not positive, but it's not even natural. And that through deep, deep discussion and very, very dedicated and difficult, mindful listening, we are able to build bridges and overcome the hatred or build foundations to enable us to be resilient in the face of hatred-producing events that come upon us in our reality. So I'm going to stop with that part of the presentation. I just want to mention that what I've said and the examples I gave you are not outliers. This week there will be another major march for peace. The wonderful organization called Tag Meir, which takes its name from Psalm 34, shun evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. That's the slogan, not the name. Will on Jerusalem Day, when a lot of the Arabs of East Jerusalem, the old city, will feel harassed by Jews celebrating the unification of Jerusalem, there will be other Jews who will walk through the streets of the old city, not singing nationalist songs or waving flags that will feel threatening to the Palestinians, but rather they will walk through the old city handing out flowers and smiling. This is one of the more remarkable initiatives of which I know, and it will be taking place this Wednesday. So there's one that's happening right now, And 2 days from now, there'll be another. And on Thursday, the Faith Friends Across Faith Initiative and Praying Together in Jerusalem will convene for their weekly session. And so there is a lot going on here. And the message that I would leave you with before we continue is there are people here who are talking to one another. It isn't easy, but it is possible. And we hope that while what goes on in Israel, Gaza, is a source of tension and challenge for Jewish and Christian and Muslim and many communities outside the land, we hope that some of what we are doing can not be a source of tension, but a source of inspiration, or at least a challenge. That if, goodness gracious, they can talk in Israel, Palestine, well, maybe here in Manchester, London, New York, or San Francisco, we can talk as well. Thank you. John?
You're muted, John.
People see my screen? Perfect. All right. So thank you so much, Ophir. And now I'll sort of try and focus on who we are at the Rosting Center for those who don't know, and what we've been doing since October 7th. So I just want to state from the beginning that the problem the Rosting Center is trying to tackle is the fact that not enough Israelis and Palestinians have the desire and capacity to live together in peace and equality. I'll just give you a quick example. I am a Palestinian Christian, but I grew up in an Israeli Jewish school. And I remember going to school on the first day and being extremely scared because I didn't know if I would make any friends. And I knew that, I didn't have the Hebrew that many of the Israeli Jewish kids had. And eventually I made good friends with this kid who was twice my size in height. I was a pretty small kid. And he just came up to me on the first day and asked if I wanted to play together. And this was the beginning of mine and Adam's good friendship. And we were good friends, and I hosted him for Christmas. He hosted me for Shabbat dinners, and we were really, really good friends. But with time, as we grew up, as we were more aware of our identities and narratives, me and Adam grew apart. We either didn't really want to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or some of the interreligious tensions that existed, or even if we did engage and try to address it in dialogue, it would completely blow up in our faces. So this is true for me and Adam, but this is definitely true for the majority of Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in the land. And it's even more so the case after October 7th and the war in Gaza. This is the problem that the Rosting Center is trying to address. And you can see here that in terms of the perception of Israelis and Palestinians, 65% of Jews, Israeli Jews, perceive, right? They believe that 65% of the Palestinians, citizens of the State of Israel, support violence and attacks against Israeli Jews. I'll say that again. 65% of Israeli Jews think that the Palestinians living inside of Israel support violence acts against them. The same with the Palestinian population within Israel. 50% of that population think that 50% of them think that Israeli Jews support violence against themselves. But of course, in reality, when you ask those populations, I don't know if only is a good is the right word here, but 2% of Palestinians inside of Israel support violent acts against Israeli Jews, and 10% of Israeli Jews support violent acts against Palestinians living inside the State of Israel. This is without the West Bank and without Gaza. You can see here, I mean, it's quite alarming that 2% or 10% would support violence, but we definitely see that the perception of the other group is far worse than the actual support itself or acts of violence. So these are the populations that we're currently working with, and this is a study that was done in February of this year. And of course, in terms of the sense of security of these populations, and this is a study done from the month of March, 77% of Israeli Jews say that they have lost, or that their sense of personal security has been damaged. And for Palestinians living inside the state of Israel, 62% of their security has been shaken, or at least 62 of them don't feel safe. Well, me and Ophir living here might ask, where are the rest of the percentage that makes 100? Because the situation is that bad in terms of how people perceive their own personal security. And again, this is without us addressing what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza. And Ophir really presented a lot of work that is being done by interreligious organizations, and there's a handful of peace-building organizations between Palestinians and Israelis, or what we call also shared society organizations that only work within the state of Israel between the different communities. There's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of organizations. But we at the Rosling Center have identified also some of the limitations of this field. And the first one is that field of peace-building organizations, interreligious organizations, it's extremely fragmented. I don't know the UK situation that well, but I would assume that it might be similar. In addition, peace-building work, interreligious work, doesn't tend to be systematic and institutional. It tends to work with individuals who belong to sort of the margins of society, those who are already convinced. Oftentimes, usually the field gets accused of preaching to the choir. Again, I don't know FODIP's context good enough to know if these are some of the issues that you too face. And the third one is that the methodologies we're using in the peace-building interreligious dialogue world are pretty weak. And just to give you an example, I remember when, again, I was in the Israeli school when I was an adolescent. When we were 16, they took our school to meet a Palestinian school inside of the state of Israel. And they put us into a room and basically brought the hot topics and told us to basically debate and argue with one another. In other words, they thought that if we would just sit in a room and talk about the sensitive matters, it would just go away. And I remember speaking to my fellow classmates, and they were worse off after the event itself. In other words, they became more hostile towards the Palestinians that they engaged with. Dialogue at times can create damage. It can create damage if it's not facilitated well, like in the case of my school, or if it doesn't address systematic issues of oppression and injustice, it can also maintain the status quo. And I'll speak a bit about one of our methodologies that's trying to toe the line between building relationships, but also addressing the sensitive topics, because you can't just do one of them. You have to do both. At the Rosling Center, we're trying to work in coalitions and in cooperation with different organizations. So the minute October 7th, the attack happened on October 7th, that evening, our amazing director, Dr. Sarah Bernstein, for those who know Dr. Bernstein, was already on a call within a coalition of organizations that said, okay, this is going to be an event that is going to change the face of the land. We need to quickly work together. And part of what we did between the months of October and December is try and reduce the violence within the mixed cities inside the state of Israel. So cities like Ramle and Lod, for those who are a bit more familiar. And what we did is we cooperated with organizations in Jerusalem to help distribute food parcels, because there were marginalized and poor families in East Jerusalem that their jobs, they were either fired from their jobs, certain of there was just no work because of the war, and also chain supplies were disrupted because of the war, and there were poor families in East Jerusalem that did not have food security. And interestingly, it was our Israeli Jewish colleague, this is a lot of credit to her, who took on this initiative. So just imagine Israeli Jew, how she was perceived by her own community, the amount of courage she had. The second thing that we're trying to do, as Ophir mentioned, is try and work more institutionally. We're realizing that we have to work with institutions and not just with participants, work with principals, with teachers, try and create systematic change. Because again, if we just work with individuals, as important as that may be, we will not see the change we want to see. So we have to work institutionally, holistically. And the third thing is we have to work with methodologies that address our multiple identities, right? Our intersectional identities, because when we come to the table, I don't just come as a Christian. I also don't just come as a Palestinian. I come with a handful of identities when I'm engaging, for instance, with Ophir in dialogue. And we're realizing more and more that we have to deal with trauma. How do we deal with populations that are extremely traumatized? And again, by no means when I say dealing with trauma and thinking about methodologies, I am also talking about addressing sensitive topics. When we engage as staff members with one another and with some of our participants, we talk about all the issues, but of course within a very structured manner and using one of our, I think, strongest tools, the healing hatred methodology. Who we are, we're about 18 staff members. Not everyone is full-time, but we have 18 staff members, half are Israeli, half are Palestinian, Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Those who are more religious and those who are more secular. This is a picture that was taken in, I think it was February of this year, in our center in Ramle called the Open House. I don't know if people have read the book, The Lemon Tree, but it's about this center. The owner of the house gave us the center in order to run activities there. So this is us in February after a staff day. And again, our staff members, like Ophir, I don't work in the field, but I can definitely say this about Ophir and some of our other staff members, but they're really experts when it comes to education and facilitating dialogue. These are just some of our programs. Half of the programs are in the educational department of our organization that focus on working with principals and teachers and institutionally with these schools and teacher training colleges, which is basically trying to give teachers and principals tools when it comes to dealing with racism, holding conflictual conversations in the classroom. And then we have our dialogue programs that focus on working with university students in Ramle and in Jerusalem. And those are the ones that also go through the healing hatred methodology. I'll quickly pass through these slides just because I know we're running out of time and I want to allow for a Q&A. What is next for the Rossing Center? We are trying to scale up the organizations, institutions, and schools we work with. We work more holistically and institutionally. We are supportive of organizations that work with individuals who really come with good intentions to peace building and dialogue initiatives, but we really believe that it has to be institutionally and holistic if we want to see change, which is of course difficult and provides many, many challenges because we have to work with the Ministry of Education. And we're trying to strengthen our partnerships both locally and internationally. I think it's pretty clear to those living in the UK that what happens here in Israel-Palestine affects what's happening in the UK and vice versa. The ability for us to live in freedom and security with complete equal rights will affect what happens in the UK. We are dependent on one another. So we're trying to strengthen our international partnerships and cooperation. How can we not only grow locally as a field, but how can we grow internationally as a field? And I guess this talk is one step in that direction. And of course, FODIP has partnered with the Rossing Center in various forms previously. So these are some of the three main issues that we're pushing forward. This is my last slide, I promise, and then we can go into Q&A. I put here tips with a question mark, because when Sadia approached us, she sort of wanted to learn what we are doing and perhaps see if it might be relevant to FODIP. And the reality is me and Ophir don't know if it's helpful, but these are some possible tips that might be food for thought. The first one is that we're doing a lot of, I misspelled here, but it's supposed to be national and intergroup work. That is to say, again, dialogue isn't always helpful. It can also do damage. And there's a lot of work for us to do internally. There's a lot of work that Israeli Jews need to do internally. There's a lot of work that Palestinians need to do internally. There's a lot of work that Christian, Muslim Jews need to do internally. And therefore, a lot of our work at the moment, at least some of it, is either completely uninational work, because people just can't come to speak to someone from the different faith or ethnicity, or because it might create damage. Or we do a sort of a hybrid version where we'll bring the groups together, then separate them, and then bring them back together. There's different formats. It depends who we're working with. The second one, as we mentioned, is focus on trauma. You know, for many Israeli Jews, like Ophir mentioned, they have friends, family who have been killed. And also it has placed many Israeli Jews into their collective trauma of the Holocaust, of anti-Semitism. For Palestinians, like myself, in the month of October, we were under threat from a fascist group who threatened both my father and my sibling and threatened to kill them. So they visited my my family members' offices, and thankfully they weren't there that day. But we were afraid they would find our individual addresses. Likewise, many Palestinians inside of Israel have been fired from their job for opposing the war in Gaza, and what for many Palestinians describe as a genocide happening. Many of them have been arrested or fired. There's not really freedom of speech at the moment when it comes to protests. And this is without speaking about, you know, I live in Jerusalem, but Bethlehem in the West Bank is my second city. I also happen to teach in an institution there. And many of the students that I work with are extremely afraid, right? How do I help them with their trauma? How do we do dialogue that is trauma informed? And the third one is empowerment, which of course relates to trauma. I remember listening to a lecture from a social psychologist who was speaking about what is the opposite of trauma. And many people in the audience said healing. But in many ways, she was arguing that it's actually empowerment. It's people having control over their lives, or at least their many aspects of their life. The fourth thing is perhaps working more systematic and holistic. And the fourth is not to shy away from the difficult subjects. This is always odd for me, but in our work, we don't shy from these topics. But when I speak to people abroad, and again, I don't know if this is true for all organizations, but they really shy away from certain subjects or topics or terminology. So these are just suggestions for perhaps things that may or may not be helpful for FODIP and other initiatives elsewhere. I'll stop now so we can sort of engage in conversation together. And again, I really encourage you to ask any questions that you may have for myself and Ophir. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, both. I think there's an awful lot of food for thought, and thank you for sharing personally. I know it's not an easy thing to do. Personally, I'm quite buoyed up to see that actually a lot of the things that FODIP has developed during this time are very much along some of the lines that you've outlined there, John. So, but even so, people find it difficult. Why are you just speaking to people in different and separate groups? Why are you not forcing people to come together and be peaceful? But you've outlined it brilliantly, and so that's excellent. Now we have questions. I think